Today we're digging into a topic I think every single person needs to understand better. I'm going to walk you through the 3 different types of ADHD, the 4 people who often get overlooked because of the different types of ADHD, and heads up, towards the end, I'll also share some signs that you might have a missed presentation of ADHD, even if you don't fit the typical picture. Let's start with the 3 types of ADHD. Number 1, Inattentive type ADHD, formerly called ADD. Inattentive ADHD is all about difficulty focusing, sustaining attention, organizing, and following through. It's not about being hyper. It's about being mentally elsewhere. For example, you sit down to reply to one email, and you look up and somehow it's 3 hours later. You've deep dived into 15 tabs, reorganized your sock drawer, and that email? Yeah, it's still unsent. What it can feel like? Constant daydreaming, struggling to finish tasks, forgetting details, even important ones, being seen as lazy, unmotivated, or spacey. I cannot even tell you how many clients have said, I thought ADHD meant you were bouncing off the walls, not that you just forget what you were doing halfway through making toast. And that's the heartbreaking part, because if you're not disruptive, if you're just quietly zoning out or drowning in forgotten tasks, people often don't notice. You just get labeled as flaky. Or worse, you start to believe that you're just not trying hard enough. Number 2, hyperactive impulsive type ADHD. This is the classic ADHD that most people think of, like high energy, impulsivity, physical restlessness. Examples of this type are things like blurting out answers in class, constantly fidgeting, tapping, moving, talking nonstop without realizing it, making snap decisions without thinking it through. It's like your brain is running 100 tabs at once, and your body is trying to match that speed, always. Hyperactive ADHD tends to get caught earlier in childhood, especially in boys, because when you're literally climbing the walls or interrupting every 5 seconds, adults notice. And it's usually labeled as, bad behavior at first, instead of realizing that it's brain wiring. Now, just my own thoughts here, but I honestly think a lot of girls who do have hyperactive impulsive symptoms learn to internalize the energy early. Instead of running around physically, we can start running internally, overthinking, over-worrying, over-analyzing. The hyperactivity doesn't disappear, it just goes inward. Almost like when we talk about BPD or borderline personality disorder and how some express it outwardly, but others turn it in and have what is known as quiet borderline. It kind of reminds me of that. Thank you to the sponsor of today's video, X-Tiles. If Notion ever felt like too much, too many blocks, too many clicks, X-Tiles might just be your brain's new best friend. Think of it as your favorite bullet journal, but smarter. Fully digital, visual, and incredibly simple to use. It's flexible enough to organize everything exactly the way your brain works. And the ease of using ready-made templates makes managing every area of your life effortless. You can start organizing your life and ideas in a second. Just add your notes, checklists, and resources on the page and adjust everything to your style. Also, it has a bunch of templates for family, habits, trip planning, coaching, and event work projects. The visual planner at its core is ADHD friendly, dopamine boosting, and specifically designed for how we naturally think. Yearly goals, monthly priorities, weekly tasks, and daily notes all layered and interconnected. Whether you're running a YouTube channel, managing a side hustle, or simply organizing everyday tasks, X-Tiles keeps everything connected, clear, and clutter-free. Try X-Tiles today. Finally, productivity that makes sense for your brain. Number 3, combined type ADHD. Combined type means you meet criteria for both inattentive and hyperactive impulsive symptoms. For example, you forget deadlines and you interrupt people during meetings. You daydream during class and you tap your foot the whole time. It's like we're being pulled in a million different directions, mentally and physically, all day long. In my experience, combined type is the most common in adults who end up getting diagnosed later in life. Because when you have a little bit of everything, it's really easy for people to miss it when you're young, especially if you're smart, polite, or good at, like holding it all together just long enough. You might mask really well in public, but completely fall apart in private. And the thing is, when you're constantly trying to juggle attention issues, impulsivity, restlessness, burnout hits so much faster. Here's what's tricky. ADHD types aren't these clean boxes. You might have mainly inattentive traits, but some impulsivity. Feeling mostly hyperactive mentally, not physically. And it shifts how it shows up depending on stress, hormones, life season, you name it. Because of the 3 different types of ADHD, there are 4 kinds of people who tend to get missed. And the first one to get missed is the quiet daydreamer. These are the people who grew up zoning out in class, losing track of conversations, or getting labeled as scatterbrained, but no one flagged it as a real issue. Because they weren't disruptive, they weren't a problem. Instead, they were often praised for being quiet, easygoing, or low maintenance, even though internally they were struggling to keep up with missing details and feeling overwhelmed. Now, what gets missed? Inattentive ADHD doesn't scream for attention the way hyperactive symptoms do. It hides behind daydreams, missed deadlines, forgotten homework, and mental exhaustion. Now, this reminds me of my good friend Lauren. She always seems unfazed by things that stress everyone else out, does most of her tasks at the very last minute, and can easily get pulled into a different topic or focus. And she seems to enjoy the unknown or the unplanned pieces of life. And to be honest, I always felt like she just floated through life. I was always just a bit jealous of her ability to not worry about the details and still make it happen. But just a few years ago, she confided in me that she had always been stressed out, felt like she was forgetting important things, and finally got diagnosed with ADHD at almost 40 years old. She was put on medication and said that it just changed her life. She's like, you can't even imagine how different I feel. She told me she's never felt this good and can't believe that it went overlooked for so long. But she wasn't disruptive. She seemed so easygoing. But she was really struggling with ADHD. The second type of person to be overlooked is the internal hyperactive. They're not bouncing off the walls. How could they have ADHD? Hyperactivity doesn't always look like climbing on furniture or constant motion. Especially in women, hyperactivity often turns inward. Racing thoughts, chronic overthinking, emotional impulsivity, internal restlessness. It feels like you're crawling out of your skin, but on the inside. Now, what gets missed? Because the hyperactivity isn't physical, it doesn't fit the stereotypical picture. These folks often get mislabeled as anxious, overthinkers, worrywarts, or too sensitive. Years ago, I had a patient like this. She was in her early 30s, smart, thoughtful, the kind of person who always noticed the little things. And she came to therapy because she thought she had anxiety. That's what she'd been told her whole life. And honestly, on the surface, that's what it looked like. But it just didn't quite fit. She wasn't forgetful or scattered in the way people usually picture ADHD. In fact, she was hyper aware, constantly thinking, planning, analyzing. Her brain never turned off. She'd say that she'd lie in bed exhausted, but totally wired. Her thoughts racing from, did I say something weird in that meeting? To, I need to respond to that text. To, why can't I just shut up sometimes? All of this would happen in the span of a minute or two, which is why she often thought it was anxiety. We associate racing thoughts with anxiety, but that's not always the case. She described this feeling like she was crawling out of her skin, but on the inside. No one else could see it. And that's the thing. Her hyperactivity didn't show up as bouncing off the walls. It showed up as emotional impulsivity, chronic overthinking, and this constant internal buzz that just never let her rest. People had always called her too sensitive or an overthinker. No one ever considered ADHD. But when we started exploring that possibility together, things just clicked. All of the restlessness, the big emotions, the impulsive decisions that she just couldn't explain, They finally made sense. And for the first time, she felt understood. Not broken, not too much, just someone whose ADHD didn't look the way people expected it to. The third type to be overlooked is the gifted or high-achieving masker. Some people with ADHD manage to hold it together for a really long time, especially if they're naturally bright, hardworking, or extremely motivated by external pressure. Hello, perfectionists. They come up with coping mechanisms like color-coded planners, setting 5 alarms, or pulling all-nighters to cover up their executive functioning struggles. From the outside, they look successful. But underneath, it's a house of cards built on constant self-management and burnout. And what gets missed is that people assume that if you're achieving outwardly, you can't possibly be struggling with ADHD. But ADHD isn't about ability. I want to say that again so you hear it. ADHD is not about ability. It's about how much effort it costs to function. And for gifted maskers, the cost is often hidden until they hit a wall, usually in adulthood when life's demands just get too big to manage with hacks alone. One of my good YouTube friends is like this. He works himself to the bone, always staying up late to edit, talking about how behind he always feels. He's incredibly bright and talented, but in order to keep up with all of his responsibilities, he's constantly running on adrenaline and shame. He jokes about procrastinating, about only being productive under pressure, but there's real exhaustion underneath. He's not lazy. He's not disorganized. He's managing a brain that makes even simple tasks feel like uphill battles. And the heartbreaking part? No one sees the cost. From the outside, he looks like he has it all together. Videos are going up, deadlines are met, fans are engaged, but inside it's a nonstop hustle to hold everything up. He's not thriving, he's surviving. And he didn't even consider that it might be ADHD until he finally got into therapy about 2 years ago and was diagnosed. And that's the reality for so many adults with this internalized, high-functioning presentation of ADHD. They've built their whole lives around masking the struggle. But that mask gets heavy, and it'll crack unless we get the support that we need and the permission to stop carrying everything alone. The fourth type to be overlooked is the survivor of chaotic environments. When you grow up in a chaotic or high-stress environment, think trauma, unstable home, poverty, chronic distraction, forgetfulness, and emotional outbursts can get written off as it's a normal response to stress. And sometimes they are. But here's the problem. If ADHD is also present underneath the chaos, it often goes untreated because people assume the struggles are only due to the external circumstances that they see. ADHD symptoms get buried under trauma responses. And even if the external environment improves later, the underlying executive functioning challenges don't magically go away. It's like the louder issue of trauma and chaos overshadows the real issues. The problems we're having, not the ones caused by those around us. Now, bonus twist, if you learn to survive by being hypervigilant, like always on edge, scanning for danger, it can actually hide ADHD for a long time because the adrenaline keeps you focused. But once you're safe, the ADHD symptoms you never noticed before can suddenly feel like they kind of crash in like a wave. If you were quiet instead of disruptive, anxious instead of physically restless, successful on the outside but exhausted on the inside, surviving chaos instead of thriving in structure, you might have ADHD that got missed. You weren't lazy. You weren't flaky. You were just unseen.